Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about the risk to reward profile of the deadlift exercise. And this is a movement that, in my opinion, tends to be more vilified than almost any other. And I think this is fueled mostly by misconception around what's actually happening during this exercise, as well as a misconception around how injuries most often occur. So here's the plan and the talking points for the video to come up. We'll talk about the injury prevalence and how often injuries occur from deadlifting, at least as best as we can deduce from the research. We'll talk about the association between deadlift technique and injury risk. And I think for most people, at least what I'm going to say there is not what you think I'm going to say. We'll talk about what matters most for injury risk. We'll then move into benefits of deadlifting specifically, at least what is reasonable to say. And then we'll just finish off with some concluding points that should summarize everything we talked about in the video. So again, as always, none of this is medical advice, and all of the references and citations that I'm using to support the claims that I'm going to make in this video can be found in the description box down below. There is an accompanying article to this video. So all of the references I'm using to support my claims can be found hyperlinked next to the claim that they seek to support. So hopefully that makes it a bit easier for you. So injury rates are most typically measured in terms of the number of injuries that occur per 1,000 hours of participation. A group of researchers is looking at how often injuries occur in relation to some sort of activity. They have some group of people perform that activity, or at least they observe them do that. A certain number of 1,000 hours are accumulated in terms of participation of that activity, and a certain number of injuries occur. Then that is sort of averaged out and fractionated down into a number per 1,000 hours. Because that's really the only way you're going to get a number that makes easy sense to look at. And there's no studies looking at deadlifts alone in isolation. Like there's no studies where they have people do only deadlifts for 20,000 hours. The injuries are averaged out there. That doesn't necessarily exist. So the closest we can get, in my opinion, is to look at powerlifting mostly, because for someone who is pursuing powerlifting as a sport, deadlifting, or at least training for the deadlift, is going to make up at least 33% of their training. And there's a number of papers that have sought out to look at the true injury rate of powerlifting as a sport. And with everything, it does depend on level of competition you're talking about and who you're actually studying. But the range that you'll see is anywhere from 1 to 4 injuries that occur per 1,000 hours. Now, something to note is that how an injury is defined isn't always super consistent across these papers. Most of the time, they'll include any sort of adverse event, no matter how mild or severe it is. So a very mild bout of low back pain that goes away overnight might be grouped as an injury the same way that someone who slips and fractures their skull might be grouped as an injury. So that's kind of an extreme example. That probably doesn't happen, but you get the case. It's not necessarily like there's one definition of injury that's super consistent across all of these studies. The best definition I think we can use for right now is anything that is going to have you alter what you do on a day-to-day basis due to pain or inhibited function or something of the like. CrossFit is obviously much more general than the sport of powerlifting, but I did want to put it in here just for sort of context. And typically across all the papers that you'll see looking at CrossFit and injury rates, you'll see 2 to 3 per 1,000 hours. So pretty much the same on average to powerlifting. Now, the thing that I really want to point out with this slide is that these numbers are actually super low. Soccer and basketball will see 8 to 34 injuries per 1,000 hours. And again, that depends on the level of competition, like, recreational, pro, amateur, things like that, whether it's a game or a practice or, anything of the sort. But in any case, the low end is over double the high end for powerlifting and CrossFit, and things that most people would say are probably more dangerous than soccer and basketball. For instance, if you're at work and your coworker says they're going to go play a game of pickup soccer after for about an hour, no one's going to bat an eye. They're going to think that's healthy, that's great, and everything of the sort. Coworker says that they're going to go train deadlifts after work, and you might hear one comment here and there saying like, "Oh, be careful, you might get yourself hurt," and the data just doesn't support. From a statistical, that word always screws me up. You get the point. The data does not support that sort of reaction. It's more emotionally, viscerally driven, that sort of thought process. And then finally, not doing any exercise at all does not reduce your risk of injury to 0. Typically, people who are sedentary will experience more musculoskeletal pain than people who are recreationally active. So here's the bottom line from this slide. Your risk of pain and injury is always non-zero. The idea of living your life pain-free, bulletproofing is more bullshit than anything else. You're going to experience pain or injury or something of the sort at some point in time. It's more worth normalizing that than acting like that's something that is an exception. Of all of the activities that you can pursue recreationally, things like powerlifting and CrossFit, things that have a high contribution of deadlift to what makes up that activity, tend to be the safest in terms of the number of injuries that occur as a result of that activity. So the next obvious thing to talk about with this sort of topic is deadlift technique and how that relates to injury risk. There's a lot that can be said about the technique for any exercise you can do, but for the deadlift, the most talked about point of technique is probably going to be the alignment of your spine as you perform the movement. More specifically, what you'll hear people commonly say is that as you perform a deadlift, that you should maintain a neutral spine, you should maintain a straight back, don't let your back around as you lift the weight or something of the sort. Now, this movement specifically is called lumbar flexion, when your lower back, specifically, not necessarily your hips per se, bends forward as you're lifting some sort of weight. And historically, this has been thought of as dangerous for primarily the discs within your back. Now, the problem with this is that this claim that lumbar flexion, isolated lumbar flexion, causes damage over time to your discs has only really been shown in dead pigs. Researchers took porcine cadavers, which are dead pigs. They provided a lumbar flexion bending force combined with a compressive force. Most of these papers using quite crazy amounts of force, upwards of like 900 pounds, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. And then in response to this loading, the discs in this dead pig tended to herniate backwards, similar to how most disc herniations occur in humans. However, there's a number of systematic reviews looking at this in living humans, which presumably you are, and consistently there does not seem to be any relationship between lumbar flexion or the posture that your back is in when lifting a load and the rates that lower back pain occurs. And here's probably the biggest thing that's going to explain that, because a lot of things can be said about that relationship specifically. I do actually have a whole other article video that talks about that, but for right now, here's probably the thing that explains that most. While you are alive, everything in your body can adapt. And that includes your discs, which that itself is even a topic I'm going to cover in a bit more detail sometime soon. If you are dead, like these dead pigs were, you can no longer adapt to loading. And so while deadlifting and deadlifting with a somewhat flexed spine, and by the way, there are studies looking at like what is the actual angle at the lower back, at the lumbar spine that occurs when people perform deadlifts with a perceived neutral spine as measured by someone looking at it with their eyes. And typically there's at least 22 degrees of flexion that occurs anyway. So you can't really avoid your spine bending to some degree when you pick anything up. But that's kind of a tangent. So back to the idea, if you deadlift, and let's say you deadlift with a somewhat bent spine, and that increases the stress placed on your disc, that's not a bad thing. As long as it's an appropriate amount of stress being placed, you recover appropriately afterwards, your discs and your muscles and your bones and everything else will adapt over time. Because you'll hear people say this general type of claim about all sorts of exercises like, oh, if you do this exercise this way, it puts stress here. That's the whole point of exercise, to induce stress intentionally. It's the dose of stress you induce that matters, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. And then finally, the fact that you're not a pig is also a pretty big confounding variable, if I had to say. So going back to the topic of the dose of stress that you induce on any area of your body, that is what's going to dictate injury risk. Load management is the sort of umbrella term that describes that idea. And an easy way to think about it is to bracket it up into these three categories, which I've provided right here. So you can induce some amount of stress on your body that is too low, it's barely perceptible, and it's not going to induce any change or adaptation in your fitness, in your body, in anything. There is an amount of load, amount of stress that you can place on the body that provides some stress, maybe makes you a little bit sore the next day, is going to reliably improve your fitness and cause you to adapt, but is not going to increase your risk of injury by, too much. And then there's a dose that is too much. It's going to provide excess amounts of stress, amounts of load. It will likely improve your fitness, but at the combined great increase of injury risk as a result of that excess stress being placed. So to put this in practice and give some examples to this, if you were going for a walk and you dropped your pen and you went and picked up your pen, you performed a deadlift. A deadlift is something we do every day. Functionally, all a deadlift is picking stuff off the ground. When you go to pick up that pen, your muscles are activating, stress is being placed to some degree, but it's not going to disturb your homeostasis by any degree. It's not going to cause you to adapt or change or anything good to happen after. At the other extreme, for an example of doing this too much, if you were to deadlift at maximum effort 3 to 4 times per week, for most people, that's probably going to be too much and not needed to really see progress in your muscle mass, your strength, your deadlift performance, or anything of the sort. However, if you were to deadlift 1 to 2 times per week at an effort level of, let's say, 7 to 8-ish out of 10, and performance of maximum effort sets was fewer and farther in between. That's going to be very safe, reliably improve your fitness, and come with a negligible amount of injury risk. Now, the thing that's, in my opinion, really important to take into account with this concept is that it's not just the dose of deadlifting that we're talking about here. Every other form of training you do across the week is going to influence what the right dose of this exercise is, as well as what your sleep status is, what your nutrition status is, how stressed you are in life in general, from work, from relationships, things like things. So deadlifting any given weight might be an appropriate dose on a day you're feeling good, but it might be too much on a day where you're slept like crap, where you're super stressed, where you haven't eaten too much throughout the day. So this concept works best when you take everything that can be taken into account. And again, this is true of everything, every type of exercise you can do, not just deadlifts. And again, when it comes to injury risk, this is what matters more than technique. This is what you should focus on above everything else. Now, when we're talking about the benefits of performing the deadlift, it's worth noting that you're going to get the benefits of strength training in general, of which there are many, including a decreased risk of sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle mass. And again, I just want to sort of opine here. Sarcopenia, in my opinion, is less so age that causes this age-related loss of muscle mass. It's just that most people do not exercise, time goes by, and if your body has no reason to keep the muscle, it's not going to, because muscle is calorically expensive to keep and maintain. So it's not just reduced risk of sarcopenia. You can fight off most of it with strength training regularly. There's some degree of an increase in your basal metabolic rate. So like I said, muscle is calorically expensive. The more of it you have, the more calories you're going to burn at rest. This isn't as big of an impact as most people will sort of claim, but it is enough to make it worthy of including here. Improved cognitive function. Studies demonstrate time and time again that people who regularly strength train tend to do better on tasks where it is memory recall oriented, word association oriented, or anything of the sort. Your risk of diabetes and your risk of cardiovascular disease, both of which tend to go down significantly when you induce strength training as a habit. And then finally, the same way that your muscles have to adapt to increased load over time, so do your bones. So as you push and train with more weight over time, your bones have to become thicker and stronger in order to handle that increased weight. Now, with all that said, there's really two things about deadlifts specifically that I think are a bit unique to them as opposed to most other exercises that you can do. So one, they probably are the best exercise in order to load your spine with weight. So in states of osteoporosis, so age-related declines of bone mineral density, of brittle bones, let's say. The problem with this is that it significantly increases your risk of enduring a fracture. And one of the most common places where these osteoporosis-induced fractures occur is in the spine and the hips also, for that matter. Deadlifts are going to allow you to apply the greatest amount of load, the most specifically to the hips and to the spine, more than almost any other exercise. So when we talk about reducing risk of osteoporosis, deadlifts are going to do that in probably the most important parts of your body where you could reduce that risk. Another benefit that can be said to be specific to deadlifts is the fact that they train pretty much everything, and they do so effectively, which is itself quite unique. So for instance, if you were to do something like a squat into a shoulder press, like a thruster, for instance, your shoulders are going to hit failure, get tired far before your legs ever do. And so the stimulus on your shoulders is going to be significantly greater than the stimulus on your legs, and your legs will never get too much out of it, so to speak. That is not necessarily true of deadlifts. They train a lot and they do all of that pretty effectively. You can't take your deadlift from 135 pounds to 315 or 405 or some notable jump and not have significant increases in the amount of muscle on your legs and your back both at the same time. You just will have that. So if you only have 2 to 3 days per week that you can dedicate toward strength training, there's not much of a better exercise selection that you can pick from. And then, in my opinion, there can be said to be something of a protective effect from this type of exercise. So let's say you're picking up a couch that's 150 pounds. Someone who has a maximum deadlift of 135 pounds is probably going to be more at risk of hurting themselves picking that couch up than someone who has a deadlift of 315 pounds maximum. So we talked about a lot, but this slide should sum up pretty much everything. I do think there's one more after. Yeah. Okay. So a couple points and we'll sum up pretty much everything we talked about. So deadlifts are part of life. You cannot go your life without deadlifting. I'm not necessarily one to say that a movement has to mimic what you do in real life for it to be worthwhile to do, but in any case, deadlifts you're going to be doing them. There's no getting away from them. The actual rates and prevalence of injuries that occur as a result of deadlifting is significantly lower than most people tend to think. Form and technique does matter to some degree when you're performing a deadlift, but it is not the thing to focus on when you are worried about injury risk. Because again, the data in living humans just does not show a clear association between how someone lifts an object and the rates of low back pain that they are likely to incur. Properly managing load, and when I say properly managing load, again, that means taking everything that you can take into account, is the thing to focus on for managing injury risk. And that's true of everything, not just deadlifts. And then finally, strength training is probably one of the top 3 most health promoting activities you can do on a day-to-day basis. And deadlifts arguably provide the most optimal stimulus for improving bone mineral density, being time efficient, and potentially in reducing injury risk in a day-to-day life. So that's all I have for you today. Hope you found that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere between. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, comment them down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you have a good day, and I'll speak to you soon.